Welcome, everybody, and a good morning, good afternoon, and a good evening from wherever you're joining us. Hopefully, you still have some energy left over from the exciting first panel to join us on what is going to be a very lively second panel talking about China's economic transformation and the impact, particularly in the global south. And we've got a great panel, as Renee mentioned to you. Let me just talk a little bit about the format. I'm going to say a few introductory words, and then we're going to get to our panelists. And I'm hoping our panelists will keep their remarks quite contained because we really want to make this an interactive discussion with you than to take your questions and to spark a much more lively debate and discussion about it. Before we get to your panelists, let me just give you a little bit of a setup about this topic. I first went to China when I was a teenager in the late 80s. And when I lived in China in 1988, 89, China was one of the poorest countries in the world at that time, considerably poorer than most African countries and even those in the rest of Asia. I remember when I was living with my host family, we had little coupon books for food rations. So we had oil, we got peanut oil on Mondays, we got vegetables on Tuesdays, and we'd ride up and we would collect it. There were virtually no cars. Only there were some taxis, these little mianbao, these little small taxis. There was no color either. People wore brown and black and gray and blue. And what's amazing is that in my lifetime, and I'm 54 years old, China has transitioned from being a country that had no color and food and basically food rations, and one of the poorest countries in the world that did very little trade with the rest of the world, to the second largest economy on the planet, on a trajectory to eventually possibly become the largest economy in the world, certainly the largest trading power in the world. And today, as it transitions away from the low technology that it started, that people, I took the trains for many years from central China down to Shenzhen and Dongguan and those places, and was filled with young people looking for jobs in the factories. Today, those jobs are no longer that appealing anymore. China doesn't have the young people that it used to have to fill those factories. So China's modernizing, and China's domestic economic transformation is having a tremendous impact internationally. But China is a complex actor. On the one hand, we can make the argument, and we could spend this hour talking about how China is the best thing that's ever happened to global South countries, producing products that are much more affordable in its scale than anybody else could do, and providing people with very limited incomes and disposable income in particular, the opportunity to enjoy products that those who are wealthier have taken for granted. Those are all wonderful benefits of China's export boom and the made in China. But at the same time, China is also one of the key reasons that keeps many developing countries at the bottom of the economic pyramid, particularly in Africa, where nobody can beat the China price, the famed China price that is so competitive. Nobody can produce products at the scale and quality that China can do. Nobody can produce 10 million iPhones in the space of 2 weeks right before a launch and distribute them worldwide. That is a unique capability of China. That makes it very, very difficult for other countries to build up their own manufacturing centers to compete with China. So these are the issues that we're going to dive into today, is to explore the complexities of the Chinese transformation and where it is today in the global South. And as Renee mentioned, we have an amazing panelist from around the world. Let me just restate who our guests are so that you really appreciate the quality of the commentary you're going to hear. Professor Amal Nagah Elbeshbishi is an economist at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Professor Elbeshbishi, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome. It's such a great honor to join this great conference. I really enjoyed panel one, and I'm looking forward to the discussion in panel two. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we're really looking forward to hearing your insights. We're also joined by Susanna Tjhin, who is the co-founder and director of strategic communication and research at the Gentala Institute, an Indonesia-based business and management consulting company. Indonesia, of course, being a critical country for China in Southeast Asia. Christine, wonderful to have you with us today. Ooh, Christine, you're on mute. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
It's both a great pleasure and also honor to be in this panel. I look forward to the exchanges of insights. Thank you.
Wonderful. And then we're also joined by Dr. Edward Tse, founder and chief executive officer of Gaofeng Advisory Company that has offices in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Dr. Tse, thank you so much for your time and being with us. We're looking forward to your insights.
Thank you, Eric. My pleasure to be here.
And finally, from India, we are joined by Dr. Srikanth Kondapalli, who is the Dean of the School of International Studies and a professor at the Center for East Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Kondapalli.
Thank you very much. Delighted to join the discussion. Looking forward to. Thank you, Eric.
You see, we have a group of panelists from different parts of the world, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to really dissect the relationship that China has with these different parts of the world. Again, the underlying theme is that China is a complex actor. There is no simple narrative here, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to look at the pros and cons and the impact from different regions. Edward, let's start with you. Just to help us kind of give us the big picture to start our conversation in terms of how has China's economic transformation really, transformed its relations with its trading partners across the world. I told you back in the late 80s, when I was first there, China barely did any trade with the rest of the world. That's not the case today. Can you help us kind of set the scene for us as to what the past 25 years of economic reform and opening have done for China's relationships particularly with the global South?
Thank you, Eric. I heard your little story about yourself and how you first went to China. I'm a Hong Kong Chinese myself. My parents were immigrants from the Guangdong province in mainland China. So when I was very young, my parents would occasionally take me back to my home villages. But of course, when I was young, I didn't know anything at all. But any faint memories that I had about China at that time was very similar to what you described, Eric. It was poor, it was underdeveloped. It took a long time to go from Hong Kong to my home village, which is only really, maybe I don't know, maybe 100 kilometers away from Guangzhou, the capital of Guangdong province. It's not that far away in today's terms, but in those days it took a long time. And for myself, then after I finished high school in Hong Kong, like most Hong Kong or many Hong Kong Chinese people, I went to the US and study and get a few degrees, and then I started working in the US as a management consultant. And then I slowly moved back to Asia in the 90s. And in early 1990, actually in 1993, early in January, specifically, I started the Shanghai office of the Boston Consulting Group, which is I'm sure you all know is very good American headquartered or international strategy consulting firm. And at that time, Eric, I'm sure you resonate with this. Actually, Deng Xiaoping just made this visit to Shenzhen and later to Shanghai to remind people in Beijing to continue the reform and opening up, because there was somewhat of a backward trend since the 89, as you remember, Eric, I'm sure. And then at that time, all of a sudden, a lot of foreign companies would come because they were looking at outsourcing their manufacturing to China. At that time, China was just opening up, so labor costs and all the other factors for productions were very cheap compared to the West. And so, as the first and the only international consulting firm working in China or authorized to operate in China at that time, we were very busy. We had a lot of projects with foreign companies and helping them to enter the China market. So that was more than 30 years ago. And over these 3 decades, I've been working with, I don't know how many by now, but a significant number of foreign and Chinese companies on how they think about business. I think to answer your question, Eric, the relationship between China and the rest of the world have really undergone profound changes over the last several decades. Initially, China was viewed by many Western nations or companies as a place to do low-cost manufacturing. I think around the 2000s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, China began to so-called upgrade its manufacturing. They at least tried, starting with Guangdong, to upgrade the manufacturing to what they call a higher level of manufacturing. That process has been going on actually for over 20 years by now. And I think what we're now seeing, and I'm sure we'll be discussing a lot of this, is that during this couple of decades, China really has evolved from a very primitive manufacturing base to now the world's leading manufacturing nation. And it's not only about the capacity, but also the quality of manufacturing, which is increasingly more advanced in technology. Innovation is really prevalent all over China today. And because of that, the relationship in terms of trade between China and many other countries in the world has changed significantly. Before, it was sort of export of low-cost, products. Today is multidimensional. There's still some low-cost manufacturing, but a lot of them has been moved out of China to other places. But increasingly, China is manufacturing very sophisticated products. And that relationship is becoming very intricate, in particular with the Global South countries. I will stop here for now, Eric.
Wonderful. Yeah, you've raised some key points here. And what's so interesting, and normally when I'm not in Washington, which I'm very rarely in Washington, I live in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. And Edward, I can kind of relate to what you're saying in terms of the transformation. 10 years ago, when I moved to Vietnam and I would order something online, it would take 2 weeks for a product to come from China. Today, when I order something on Lazada, which is Alibaba, it comes in 24 hours. And the speed of change that's happened is just breathtaking. China trades more with Southeast Asia than any other region in the world, almost $1 trillion a year. Christine, this puts you right in the middle of where China's major focus is. And Southeast Asia has historically been the closest region, not only because of geography, but because of large diaspora Chinese populations that helped to open up China's trade to the world. They were the first to really pioneer this. Maybe, Christine, you could help follow on what Edward was saying in terms of laying the groundwork for us to better understand both Indonesia, but more broadly about China's engagement in Southeast Asia.
Thank you. I think just to sort of like go in tandem with your stories, I also, the first time I went to China was in the mid-80s. I was just year high, and at that time, because diplomatic relations between Indonesia and China was frozen, we can't go to China legally, technically. So we have to go through Hong Kong, and there's a piece of paper where they were going to immigration was stamped sort of like on that paper. But basically, there's no access. There's no direct access from Indonesia to China. And going back and like putting this back into the dynamics of China's open door policy in the late 70s and how Southeast Asia responses, you have to remember that right after the open door policies, only 3 of the ASEAN member states started to normalize relations with China. Malaysia in 74, Philippines and Thailand in 75. It took like 2 decades for countries like Indonesia, Singapore, and Brunei to actually then normalize relations with China. And the rest of the rest of the currently member of ASEAN at that time was not a member of ASEAN, then would sort of like continue to normalize relations with China in the 90s. This is pretty much highlight the starting point that pretty much sort of like highlight create some sort of like precedent in terms of how diverse Southeast Asia's response to China will be. So this is, of course, like just one aspect of it. You can always sort of like see the diversity of domestic political, socio-political, economic situations in each individual countries, and also how ASEAN has evolved as a single entity. From the initial 5 to the now 10 and possibly 11 with the accession of East Timor under the discussion at the moment. But pretty much like China's economic transformation is very much interlinked with Southeast Asia, regardless of the geopolitics, etc. I mean, if you look at the 1980s, when China starts with the accelerations of the economic reform, And in particular, if you look at the special economic zones that beginnings in the 1980s, ironically, actually, Deng Xiaoping at that time took inspirations from Singapore and Batam in Indonesia for these special economic zones. But if you look at it now, there's like over 80,000 categories of special economic zones in China that has been driving the rise of China. Whereas, like, Singapore has developed, but Batam in Indonesia has remained stagnant and failed to sort of like, become the engine of growth that we have. In the 1990s, China began with the marketization and also the global integrations of their economy, most prominently with the reform of state-owned enterprises, where state-owned enterprises in China were given a channel to have a limited privatization and also the encouragement of private entrepreneurship that began to sort of like, probably kickstart the initial of the China Go Global first phase. And followed by the 2000 period with the rise of manufacturing and also the export-led growth, especially highlighted with China's accessions to WTO and also China becoming ASEAN's dialogue partner in 2003. This definitely influenced the regional economic integration that has been pushed by countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, considering the fact that ASEAN is Indonesia's quote-unquote cornerstone of Indonesia's foreign policy. So this kind of like activities, the export-led growth becoming the world's factory is pretty much influencing the region. And of course, key to that is the infrastructure development within China that enable this kind of like establishment of this global factory. But of course, we can another aspect that I would like to highlight in this period is the fact that not only the greater engagement of China in the regional architecture, particularly with ASEAN, 2003 becoming ASEAN's dialogue partner, and then the establishment, and then 2009 becoming ASEAN largest trading partner, and then also in 2010 become the establishment of ASEAN-China free trade area. So you see the gradual surge of trade between China and the region. ASEAN countries with different sort of like capacities and also contribution become supplier of raw materials and components for China manufacturing sector, trade surging, but investment has been growing somewhat less dynamically. You can sort of like see a more noted FDI from China to the region around 2006, and even at that time, it's still sort of like pretty much like lower to Japan or United States. But another aspect in that period that is significant with the engagement with the region is the role of subnational government. You see Yunnan province with the Greater Mekong Sub-region area engagement. You see Guangxi with the Pan-Peipu Gulf area engagement. And more recently, with some of the concept of the industrial parks, like two countries and twin parks, like Indonesia with Fujian province and Philippines with other provinces. So these are sort of like the highlights that show sort of dynamic that allow sort of like greater engagement with the region. By the 2010, you have the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's like bringing the situation on another level, particularly with the significant strategic aspect where the willingness of the orientation of the Belt and Road in terms of the development and infrastructure that is desperately needed in Asia and in Southeast Asia, because the previous FDI regime is pretty much dominated by private sector, and most of the private sector are reluctant to invest in infrastructure. So with the arrival of that and it gives us another different type of boost for the regional economic activities and also economic integration. So and now a decade after Belt and Road, you see a lot of challenges and opportunities coming in. Ranging from different type of trade dependency with China, trade imbalances and everything. I mean, in terms of bilateral, you see the most hottest topic in Indonesia at the moment, the narrative about imposing 200% tariff for Chinese import on certain products. There's a lot of like misconception, misinformation, and misinformation on that. There's a lot of exaggerations being triggered by the number of 200%. That freaks me out, even myself personally. but this kind of like narrative, it sort of goes in tandem with the reality of how misinformation and disinformation about China in the region is prevalent, in the sense that there are a lot of aspects of it. I would sort of like point out the role of media in the region, you know, as, particularly in terms of the dominance of Western mainstream media as present in the region, and also in terms of how China's recent media expansion, global media expansion, we can argue in terms of how that kind of outreach has been effective or not. But basically, that's pretty much sort of like affecting the China's economic transformations, and that's sort of like some of the aspect of it. And I think I'll just stop here first before we can sort of like touch other topics.
Thank you, Christine. And also, let's not forget that Southeast Asia is also the front line of the great power competition that's taking place more intensely there than almost anywhere else in the world. And that complicates these dynamics as different countries get pulled into different directions. While Southeast Asia is China's largest regional trading partner, Africa is at the other extreme, does about $282 billion in total trade. The bulk of China's trade with Africa is concentrated in just about 5 countries, with 3 countries alone accounting for 62% of exports. 89% of China's imports from Africa are in extractives, in raw materials. This is a relationship that has grown enormously over the past 20 years. But in some ways, it's revolutionary, and in other ways, it looks like the trading relationships that Africa has had for decades. Professor Elbeshbishi, let's talk to you about your vantage point at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. China has in many ways been transformational in Africa for building infrastructure, extending finance, being a major trading partner in extractives. But again, at the same time, it's a complex actor. Major trade deficits across the continent also make it very difficult for many countries. Talk to us a little bit about the China-Africa relationship as you see it from up in North Africa.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished participants. It's such a great honor for me to participate in this great conference, to shed some lights actually on the China's expanding influence in Africa. And as you mentioned, there are challenges and opportunities. So how to navigate the challenge and harness the opportunity is a real key, actually. So I will just try to shed some light on a few points. First of all, actually, while much of the West overlooks Africa, China has emerged as a keen and enthusiastic partner for the continent. So this is a great comparative advantage for China in Africa. Africa is, as a continent, is often perceived as poor and corrupt, but some of the best investment opportunities, so these are like the opportunities, arise where perception diverges from reality, where conditions are better than they appear. And China here really perceived these kind of opportunities and harness it. So Africa fits this description perfectly. China spotted that very well. Africa is undervalued and presents challenges for investment. And it's a bit, the situation is a bit more or less similar to how former communist Eastern Europe and Russia were viewed in the early 1990s. Then when it comes to China's efforts in Africa, they are actually driven by economic self-interest rather than altruistic development policies. But this is normal in international relations. But for China to achieve superpower status, if we want to think about different countries, for example, China needs Zambian copper, needs Nigerian oil, Tanzanian timber, South African platinum. So their strategy employs significant investment as a form of soft power. And when we want to think about soft power, think about Chinese investment in financing roads in Ethiopia, building schools and hospitals in Liberia, rebuilding Angola's renowned Benguela Railway, and initiating a road building program in Mozambique. So the influx of Chinese investment has revitalized large parts of Africa, significantly improving infrastructure in many regions over the past years. And this is a clear example of soft power and supporting the African continent. But then when it comes to comprehensive national power and the strategic importance of Africa, we can say that Africa is home to some of the weakest developing countries, but at the same time, Africa plays a unique role for China in international affairs. So, it's not actually a partnership between China and Africa. Is not a partnership between horses and riders, but in fact, actually, it's a mutual benefit. Like, for example, Africa plays a unique role for China in international affairs. With 54 member states, Africa takes up almost 1/4 of the United Nations General Assembly seats. And of course, in today's fast-changing world, where unipolarity competes with multipolarity, China needs the support of the vast majority of developing countries, of course, including African countries. Of course, when it comes to African countries, yes, they are very impressed about the success of China in the reform and opening up of its economy. So it's a really great success story and role model to follow. African countries are also interested in the Chinese experience in exploring modes of development. The technological know-how and managerial expertise of Chinese enterprises could be useful reference for African countries. So in this sense, actually, there is a great potential for cooperation between China and Africa. To avoid being really taking a long time, for now, I can just conclude by saying that, China stresses that it is a different type of global power. China is a developing country that understands Africa's development needs and is better equipped to advocate for Africa at international trade negotiations. China also stresses that China-Africa relations are win-win relations and promote this message, whether bilaterally and within African regional organizations. China is also increasing awareness of its country in Africa by promoting Chinese language and cultural studies on the continent and providing scholarship for good students to go to university on the mainland. And this is another clear example of soft power or soft diplomacy. And of course, many Africans believe that China has a positive impact on the world. They also demonstrate an increased interest in Chinese language and culture. With this, I end my intervention for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. We really appreciate it. And also, if you're interested in China-Africa issues, coming up on September 3rd to September 8th is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit. This is a triennial event. It's going to be a very important event and will give us a good indication of where we are in the health of the China-Africa relationship. Also, what the professor mentioned, about 1/4 of the seats in the United Nations. In the BRICS today, African countries account for 1/4 of the seats of the BRICS. So the BRICS is one of the only international organizations there that Africa has a very strong influence, and that's, again, at the urging of China. So very interesting. So thank you very much, Professor. And so we've saved one of the most complex relationships for last, and that brings you, Professor Kondapalli, in India. India and China, of course, share a border. It's a very contentious relationship. It's a relationship that in the past several years has deteriorated considerably. to the point where there are no more journalists in each other's countries. There are no more direct flights in each other's countries. There is considerable distrust between the leaderships of both countries. And it is yet, though, amidst all of this, just as it is with the US-China relationship, trade is still going up. And that is something that, again, is very confusing. And this is all, consistent with what I hope you will take away from this conversation, that these are complex issues with they're not binary, that it's all bad or it's all good. Professor Kondapalli, again, the India-China relationship is among the most contentious and most complex in the world. Could you give us a very brief overview of where we are today in that, and particularly as it relates to the economic transformation issue?
Thank you very much, Eric. Let me also thank the organizers and greet my fellow panelists. The first session and the second session have been really fantastic in terms of outlining the economic issues of China and what it means for the global economy. What I will try to do is, as I had circulated before, some 5 points related to the Chinese economy, which without much repetition, let me flag a few and say what is its impact on India as of now, and probably compare these two economies. China is the second largest economy, and India is the fifth largest economy in the world, aspiring to be the third largest economy by 2027. So it is interesting to find the contrast between the two economies, which I will flag in a while. But to start with, the Chinese economic model, which is now almost 4 decades in implementation, and the new leadership since the 18-party Congress is trying to tweak this model. It has been mentioned in the first panel about the model, and so there are discussions at the 5-year plan making or the plenary sessions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And next week is the third plenum of the 20th Party Congress, which is likely to discuss further how the China model, economic model, is to be readjusted to the current situation. But we already saw some signals like the shift towards dual circulation strategy since the 13th 5-year plan, basically moving away from exports to increase the domestic consumption. Currently, the domestic consumption is set to be around 40% of the GDP, in comparison to the Indian consumption of nearly 59% of the GDP. While India is not as close to the US being termed as consumption-driven economy, yet I think the 59% of consumption in India is far above than the Chinese consumption pattern. This generally has an impact in terms of the GDP growth rate. And so there are a few delegations which came from China to India some decades ago to learn the consumption pattern in India. So that is one comparison here. The Chinese are also moving towards the supply side structural reforms, which then also means that the tweaking is under the consideration. Also, in the 19th and 20th Party Congresses, there was the mention about moving towards high quality development. And as a result of that, Make in China 2025 campaign was launched in 2015, focusing, as Professor Tse mentioned in the initial session, about the AI fourth industrial revolution products like 3D printing, Internet of Things, and so on and so forth, EVs and others, which China has been very successful in that transition. But most also important is the given the Gini coefficient issues in China between the urban and rural households, the income inequalities, there is also the slogan of common prosperity. And next week, the third plenum of the 20th Party Congress is likely to reiterate the common prosperity program. Let me just analyze these things that I just mentioned. So the last 4 decades of Chinese model is under re-examination because previously there is heavy reliance on high savings to fund high investment. That is now being examined given the real estate problems, the banking crisis, and other avenues of savings by the Chinese consumers. The second is in terms of low to medium technology transition in the manufacturing sector because of the kind of pollution that we saw in the Chinese economy. So this transition between to low to medium manufacturing sector is and to high tech sector is a major debate in China today and is also likely to be reflected in the next week's third plenum meeting. Export-oriented economy has come under stress because of the U.S. tariff wars and the semiconductor ban imposed last October by the Biden administration. So this is the key problematic for the Chinese economy. Finally, in terms of this model of development, in July 2021, President Xi Jinping mentioned in a conference that China needs to focus more on genuine rather than inflated GDP figures. As the Rhodium Group mentioned this year, that the GDP growth rate in China has been tweaked, and it said it is about 2% growth rate in comparison to the official 5% growth rate that is mentioned by the National Bureau of Statistics. The second aspect is in terms of the dual circulation, basically on domestic consumption patterns.
Dr. Kondapalli, just one more minute, if that's okay, just so we were running
yes,
short on time.
I will wind up quickly. So, given these debates within China, what is the impact on India? As I was mentioning before, both are aspiring to a higher growth model, which is environment friendly and so on, and consumer driven. In this process, there is also a lot of variance between the two models in China and India. Number one is today Indian exports are picking up. Previously, it was just about $450 billion that India has. Now it is more than $1.2 trillion of exports and imports. That has been one of the focal areas. Second is in terms of the high-tech exports. China is doing well and has been transforming its economic model. Yet the outside factors, external factors, are leading to a lot of problematic. China is the largest trading partner for India at around $118 billion, as Eric mentioned. Yet we see that these two models are separate to each other. There is less interaction between the two, other than in the WTO dispute resolution, climate change proposals, or in the other multilateral agencies. India is one of the founding members of the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Of course, due to the Ukrainian conflict, there is some restriction in terms of the investments by the AIIB related to Russian factor. But nevertheless, these are the areas of interaction as of now. Overall, they seem to be working at variance with each other, given the territorial dispute that the chair had alluded to. So we see these going through two parallel tracks as of now, with very less interaction, and it is a buyer-seller kind of relationship as of now. So it is possible that this kind of interaction may change in the near future if they resolve the territorial dispute and other outstanding problems between the two countries. Thank you for your attention.
Sure. There is some encouraging news in the fact that China now has an ambassador in New Delhi, which is something that hasn't happened for almost 2 years. So there is some progress that's happening there. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to take our conversation and open it up to the entire panel. And I'm going to start on a point that Christine brought up about the 200% tariffs that were imposed on certain Chinese imports. This is part of a broader trend that we're seeing across the global South right now. South Africa imposed tariffs on goods under 500 Rand, about $18. Same kinds of tariffs as what Indonesia imposed. South Africa also imposed a 10% tariff on solar panels. Brazil, Mexico, and Chile have all imposed tariffs on
I think Eric just froze.
This is the over. What's that?
Sorry, I think you just froze from my screen. Sorry. Can you repeat the last sentence? Sorry.
I'm not quite there yet. So we're just talking about setting up the fact that a growing number of developing countries are imposing tariffs on Chinese imported or Chinese imports from steel to consumer goods and whatnot. This concern about overcapacity is a very sensitive issue in the US-China, Europe-China relationship, but it is also an issue in the global South. So I'd like to start with Christine and then go to Edward to talk about this question of Chinese exports overwhelming some global South countries and the pushback that we're seeing from several countries in the form of tariffs. Christine, let's start with you. And again, if we can keep our remarks quite short, that'll make a more lively conversation.
With regard to this tariff, I think in overall, like I said earlier, the 200% number is just a narrative that's being sort of like proposed by one of the government officials in Indonesia. It hasn't been confirmed yet. It is based on some of the research that's been done by the Committee of Anti-Dumping in Indonesia on a very particular sector, which is the ceramic, where they found that over 180 to 190% of the price was sort of like induced by some of the government subsidies. And it has created a very fatal sort of like disruptions to domestic economy. And I think I got a lot of questions in terms of how this will affect Indonesia's commitment with RCEP, considering the fact that Indonesia is the brain behind RCEP, and RCEP has just only 1 year sort of like progressing. I like to highlight the point that even within the RCEP regulations, there are issues. There are regulations that regulate issues of dumping that gives host countries the ability to do research and sort of like to prime proof, etc. So it's within that. But I guess in general, in that particular sort of like plan for the tariff, there should be more sort of like negotiation, sort of like dialogue, etc., to clarify and also finding ways in terms of how to shift that kind of like dumping, the practices of dumping, and find other incentives for the Chinese exporters, to be able to engage Indonesia or Southeast Asia in general. That's one point in the bilateral sense. And second of all, I think it's different in terms of while the concern is quite widespread and also prevalent in terms of China's overcapacity and protectionism, anti-globalization, etc., I don't think this is the case of that in Indonesia. It's a very particular sector. It's a relatively small sector compared to the overall trade of Indonesia. And it's also something that has been over-exaggerated in the media because of the nature of our media, and also the fact that there has been sort of like a balanced coverage over the situations of economic engagement with China, be that trade or investment. But nevertheless, I guess the issue of protectionism is something that the region has to deal with, because I think within the framework of regional supply chains that we're trying to push, especially in the situations where geopolitical situations are increasing in terms of tensions, the perpetual proxy war, and also the situations with the coming US presidential elections and how that would likely impact the relations with China vis-a-vis dynamics in the region. Not to mention also in Indonesia's particular case, we just finished our election, we're going to have new government soon. And so this is going to be a very complex situation that requires a lot of sort of like dialogue mechanisms, consultations, etc. That's why I guess like Indonesia's decision to remain committed to ASEAN-centered multilateral mechanism is very useful, because it's the only existing platform that it has been enduring. Some may criticize as ineffective, but it can actually provide sort of like the already existing channel for further dialogue and sort of like engagement between China and the region, be that as an institution, as ASEAN, and also in term as individual Southeast Asian member states.
So, Edward, let's pick up the conversation with you from what Christine was talking about. The Chinese economy, as you mentioned, is changing. It's slowing. But yet at the same time, there's the output is considerable and exports are still very important. Those concerns about protectionism in the global south are real. They're happening in lots of different countries. Some, as Christine pointed out, are maybe more manufactured and more media driven, but others, such as steel in Mexico, are absolutely legitimate and they're real. Talk to us a little bit about the relationship between Chinese production and protectionism in global south countries.
Yeah, I think there are two things that's happening today, Eric, and I will try to keep my comments brief so that we have a better conversation. Um, on one hand, in many of the situations, many clients I work with in many industry, supply chains are actually being more concentrated within China, mainly because of the Chinese capabilities in general. So there's unlike what most people talk about, supply chains have been leaving China, maybe some of that. But in fact, there's a phenomenon of supply chain being more concentrated in China because of the overall capabilities of the supply ecosystems in China. At the same time, there's also a trend of supply chain diversifying away from China. And it's driven a lot by Eric, what you described about how the Chinese manufacturers are going overseas, in particular to global South countries to set up their manufacturing base. And why is that the case? One is, of course, is the tariffs that you mentioned already, right? That's a mechanism that drives a lot of the Chinese manufacturers' decision to go overseas. The other is geopolitics. It's that geopolitics. Uh, you know, many companies are trying to manage the risk by placing their manufacturing locations in other countries. And in this process, actually, I think we're seeing a couple of things. One is that uh, China's creating a lot of low-cost products. Some people call it overcapacity, some people call it subsidy, and so on. But the output is the Chinese manufacturers are able to create very low-cost products, very sophisticated, very high-quality product, but at a very reasonable cost. And that's because of the supply chain capabilities within China. That's overwhelming. And I've seen it myself over the last several decades and how the Chinese are able to manage that. Then when, this lower cost manufacturing, when it goes out of China into the global South countries, on one hand is perhaps affecting on a negative way on the economic development of those countries, as you mentioned, Eric, right? Because, okay, well, things become, how can you compete with the Chinese is the way to talk about. But on the other hand is that because of the availability of a low-cost products, many of the consumers or the customers in the global South countries are able and can afford to buy products that they could not buy before because the alternative before offered products that they cannot afford to buy, and now it's possible for them to buy, and actually to a lot of developing countries, it's beginning to change the way that people live their life, for good or for bad. In some cases, it's for bad. In some cases, for good, depending on what product and services we're talking about. But I think there's also fundamental changes that we're seeing from that dimension, Eric. So it's not just one side. I think if you look at it, as you said, it's pretty complicated. I will stop here for now.
Yes, so Professor Elbeshbishi, let's pick up on what Edward was saying there. So, and Africa is really, again, right at the center of this discussion, benefiting enormously from the low-cost products and the exports that China is manufacturing. But at the same time, those low-cost exports that China sells make it almost impossible for African producers to compete. And we see this over and over again, whether it's textiles in Kano in Nigeria, whether it's consumer goods, and it keeps Africa in many respects as a commodity exporting rather than moving up the value chains. How do you reconcile in Africa the contradiction that Edward talked about? The low cost goods are great, but that makes it difficult to compete.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm trying to get over the fact of being economists and talking about on one hand, on the other hand, but it's difficult.
Right. But that's what we
Yeah,
have to do. That's what we have to do
exactly.
here.
Because actually, on the one hand, for Africa, like continuing rapid growth in China may lead to complementary positive effects by increasing demand and revenues from Africa's resource exports. And the Chinese also may continue to ramp up aid and investment in Africa, particularly investment in Africa's export infrastructure. So, but then on the other hand, which is the major challenge, Chinese export competitiveness in manufacturing specifically may continue to have exterminatory effect on local manufacturing in Africa, and we saw that in many African countries you cannot manufacture, and for others they cannot even diversify, they cannot compete. And since Africa is the most useful continent, this may have a negative impact on job creation possibilities. So, in this sense, if serious policy measures are not taken to address trade capacity problems in Africa, I think we will continue facing challenges. So, in this sense, African governments need to take the initiative to evolve policy responses to the negative aspects of the relationship with China. Yes, it's a win-win relationship, but there are challenges. And we have to really be able to face it. And these challenges include, for example, technology transfer, labor and environmental standards. And to face these challenges, African governments should do their homework. They should take a leading role in setting the rules of engagement. Thank you.
That is very, you did on the one hand, on the other hand, excellent there. I also want to invite all of our audience to start submitting some questions. We have about 20 minutes left in our discussion. Stephen Lee asked a question about reshoring iPhone production, because I mentioned iPhones at the beginning of our discussion. The fact is that iPhone production will never come back to the United States, or it will never come back. It will never be in the United States ever, just because it's too expensive to manufacture anything in the United States. However, iPhone production is moving to India, about a small percentage of it, and also in Vietnam as well. So Stephen Lee asked the question as to whether or not 1 million workers that are needed to ramp up production could ever be used in the United States. No, 1 million workers could never be mobilized in the United States to manufacture iPhones, but 1 million workers could be mobilized in India. And so, Professor Kondapalli, I'd like you to take this question from Stephen Lee about whether or not we could see, for example, a replication of China's manufacturing capacity maybe in India. So Edward talked about the exporting of manufacturing to different parts of the global south. India right now is actually a beneficiary, as Foxconn and Pegasus and Pegatron, some of China's Apple's contractors, do relocate some of their production there. What are the prospects of the China plus one narrative playing out in India?
Yeah, before that, on the one hand and the other hand, the Chinese have the concept of liangshou, which is, of course, a soft hand and a hard hand compared to what economists use on the one hand and the other. But that apart, I think this is a valid question on the shifting of the Foxconn from Chengzhou to Mangalore, of the manufacturing of the iPhone 16 now currently, and this has really created a lot of production base in India. In addition to the TSMC and PSMC making semiconductor chips up to the 12 nanometer length, we have a few agreements recently with the PSMC, although TSMC and Vedanta Group deal has not yet materialized. But the stats are India used to import something like 58 million handsets in 2014, mainly from Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo. But this year, or rather in 2023, India manufactured 330 million handsets. So there is a huge increase in the manufacturing capacity. India used to import something like 210 million in 2014, last decade, but last year, India manufactured something like 130 million units, handsets. So there is huge ramp up of the capacity build up here. And compared to wage labor in Beijing or Shanghai, and compared that with Delhi, Bangalore, or other places, this is an advantage that India currently has. And some
But Dr.
220.
Kondapalli, could I stop you there very quickly? Just sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Labor is one part of the equation, but infrastructure, power supplies, road, rail, governance, these are all big parts that make China so successful in its manufacturing. Does India have that capacity as well?
India today has 27 kilometers of roadways laid down per day. And the kind of Indian Institute of Technologies, Indian Institute of Managements, and the kind of other infrastructure, both soft and hard, railway expansion, the shipyard expansion, and other infrastructure projects. India is really doing good in these last 4 or 5 years, and is catching up soon with many projects. And I think this is what the investors have noticed. In fact, India today is the largest, second largest FDI attracting country in the world. And of course, India needs to further ramp up its domestic situation in terms of labor laws, environmental protection, or others. Definitely, China has an advantage on these. But being frequent elections and the other attendant problems or rather situation, India needs to go in a very gradual manner of the reforms, the second tranche of reforms. But India has already done the GST, goods and services taxes. Secondly, in terms of unifying the market. Thirdly, in terms of the other reforms that labor laws and other issues are. Land acquisition is a problem in India. That is also now being tweaked with the parliamentary resolutions. So, so there is, as I was mentioning before, some 220 American companies have shifted. And after Shinzo Abe announced $200 billion incentives for the Japanese companies to move to Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, there is a gradual shift in this. I agree with Edward that there is the supply chain mechanism still in China, focused in China, but there is also the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative Act that was signed, and we see there is a division of labor between different countries in this part of the world, with Southeast Asia as one of the main focal areas for maritime ports, in Sabang, for example, in Indonesia, or in terms of the high-tech manufacturing zones to be established in this region.
Yeah, so Christine, Dr. Kondapalli mentioned Indonesia, and in many ways, Indonesia is a competitor to India, given the fact that it has some similarities, that it's both a large market, 300 million plus consumers, and at the same time, your current president, Jokowi, and your future president, Prabowo, are both trying to entice Chinese manufacturers to set up battery manufacturing. They want to set up more manufacturing to the China Plus One really strategy to play out there. Do you see Indonesia becoming a major hub for Chinese manufacturing in Southeast Asia?
There's definitely a desire from the government to push for that kind of like a plan. But I have to admit that Indonesia, in terms of engagement with India, is very ill-equipped, in the sense that I personally would like to see more engagement with India, in a lot of other aspects, because both countries, despite the fact that there are some similar characteristics that would put both giants in kind of like competition, but there are also sort of opportunities unexplored where we can sort of like join hands and sort of like create cooperation in terms of supporting regional economic integration. I mean, it's quite unfortunate that India cannot participate in RCEP at the moment, but we still have time. We still have sort of like faith in terms of India's commitment to create sort of like regional prosperity in the longer term. But also this, when you ask about whether Indonesia, the potential of Indonesia become a key sort of like player in China's sort of like economic sort of transformations in the region, I would like to add in terms of how Indonesia could actually be a potential alternative for the recent narrative of China plus one. You know, how there are sort of like there are activities where countries are looking for alternatives outside China to create their supply chains, regional supply chain, without, of course, excluding China, but diversify in terms of their supply chain. And Indonesia has that kind of like potential, and it's not currently explored domestically in Indonesia. But I think Indonesia, not just about the geographical proximity and the population, but I think it's also about the policy commitment towards some of the development that is synchronized with in one hand, China's domestic plan, especially in terms of promoting the green and also the digital concept of it. And I also would like to sort of like pinpoint the fact that I mentioned earlier when you asked about the tariff 200% on the ceramic sector, this kind of like tariff treatment and also protectionism, etc. If you look at the case of the textile sector in Indonesia, it is also one of the most sort of like sensitive areas for the bilateral engagement. Textile has been prone to severe competition with China. Indonesia has not been able to compete, etc. But in reality, in the sense that yes, of course, like the influx of Chinese cheap products, cheap textiles into Indonesia is detrimental to the local manufacturers. But at the same time, I was just talking to my colleagues from Central Java just yesterday. We were talking about this. There's an industrial park that has been developed in Indonesia where China has been involved. And some of the Chinese investors actually established joint ventures with local textile manufacturers and producers that can actually sort of like some of the unemployed workers that was caused by the bankrupt, some of the textile companies that were bankrupt was actually absorbed by the coming joint ventures between these new Chinese investors and also the local companies in Indonesia. So aside to the fact that the consumer can benefit from the cheaper price, there's also the reality that in this particular sensitive textile sector, there are actually situations where alternative employment are available and also possible technological transfer in developing textile industry with sort of like an upgrade in the technology and also human capital development where Indonesian workers can get the training, etc. So this is just one example of the paradox. You see the attack for the textile sectors in Indonesia, how we suffer technically in terms of it, but the consumer has the benefit of can buy sort of like cheap clothing, etc., for example, and also alternative employment for workers. So this is actually at the end of the day, it goes back to how the host country, in this case Indonesia, can sort of like create a balance and making sure what are our national interests and priorities are. In this case, how to sort of like push the development of small, medium enterprises and also labor-intensive sectors. So this is just one example of this kind of paradox. And I'm pretty sure there are similar cases in the region and also in India or even in Africa.
And just very quickly, Christine, and make it super short, Molly Ng asked a question about Malaysia. Does Malaysia offer the same potential as Indonesia, even though it's considerably smaller?
I have to admit that Malaysia has a lot of capital, social capital, and also cultural capital that allows a better engagement with China. Cultural capital in terms of language ability and also some of the business incentives that they have provided, and also in terms of how Malaysia has been relatively more engaged in terms of the high-tech development. So in that case, Malaysia has that kind of potential. But I would say that Indonesia would be a stiff competition as well for Malaysia. So you go to countries.
There we go. Also, just one final point on the China plus one theme is that, a lot of Western companies have been looking to diversify away from China, and they go to countries like Indonesia and Malaysia to look to set up new supply chains. And the problem is that a lot of the inputs for those factories all come from China. So you may set up your factory in a place like Malaysia or Indonesia, but you're still reliant on the inputs that actually make the products to come from China. So it's very difficult to set up supply chains outside of Chinese supply chains. One very difficult thing. Okay, we are wrapping up and coming out of time. I want to thank everybody for their questions that we had. And what I'd like to do is really get a final kind of reflection from each of the panelists to kind of help our audience better understand the moment that we're in as it relates to China's relationship with the global South, as it relates to the economic transformations that are underway. Edward, let's start with you. Just again, a big picture reflection that we want people to walk away with. I think you are
thank
on
you.
mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this very interesting panel. I say we are at the age where there's two forces at work. One force is trying to split the world, the other force is trying to connect the world. And I think what we're seeing that China in the middle of the two forces, right in the middle of it, and together with the global South countries. I think what we are now seeing is that the global South countries, perhaps in the first time of our history, or not, maybe not our history, at least in the last, let's say, 200 years, 300 years, that the global South countries are seeing an alternative world order or an alternative governance model that came out from the mainstream Western governance model. And this is the China model. And that China model actually is not something that came out right away. It actually has its roots in the very long history and ancient civilization of China, plus the recent reforms, starting about 200 years ago, but also in particular in the last 40 years of Chinese reforming, opening up. That, I think, to a lot of global South countries is quite enlightening that they see an alternative way of growth. To what extent, I think each country will make their own decisions on which way to go. Maybe there's more than two ways. There may be other ways too. But I think right now, this is a historical moment where many global South countries are offered with alternatives on how to go forward, and they have a choice. And it's up to them to pick which pathways they want to go after.
Thank you, Edward. And Professor Elbeshbishi, let's have you share a few final reflections. Oh, I think you are on mute as well.
Sorry. Thank you very much again for this great opportunity. We need a new way of thinking to better seize opportunities and mitigate challenges in handling China's policy towards Africa. We need new thinking, we need new measures. We have to explore the new measures, actually, in light of the spirit of keeping pace with the times and being innovative and creative. We still in Africa think of policies in the 70s and 80s. So with changes in the international situation and in accordance with the expectation of the international community and the requirements of China's modernization drive, major power diplomacy actually must be balanced with the policy towards developing countries in general and Africa specifically. However, changes taking place within Africa require that China's policy should be more focused also, making the majority of developing countries, including African countries, reliable allies of China. So possible cooperation between China and other major powers in Africa should be investigated so that Africa becomes another stage for major power cooperation. With that, I end my intervention. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Professor Kondapalli, a few final reflections from you.
I think three issues will dominate the Global South view. One is in terms of the WTO dispute resolution. This is a major issue for most of the G7 countries, and I think that is going to be the major factor. Second is in terms of climate change financing. Essentially, as the Paris 2015 had indicated about the transition, and this is affecting everybody in the Global South, and I think climate change financing is the second critical issue. Third is in terms of debt relief. This is going to come up in the FOCAC meeting as well as in G20, where the African Union was made the permanent member in the New Delhi summit last year. I think this is a factor because G20 also has a debt relief mechanism, and this is going to be a major issue. On Edward's point that this is going to be an alternative, we used to have the Washington consensus and then the Beijing consensus. We are now hearing about Mumbai consensus. Thank you.
Okay, that's a new one, the Mumbai consensus. Christine, you are going to get the last word of this discussion.
Just two brief points in terms of the following up with Professor Kondapalli in terms of the green development prospect, etc. I feel a little bit disillusioned, and I think the similar disillusion also occur in the region in terms of seeing how green development fight to sort of like avoid climate change, etc. was thought as the low-hanging fruit, where we thought like geopolitics will not be affecting this because this is where we can cooperate because it's affecting everybody else. It doesn't happen. So it's like a huge competition. You see Indonesia with JETP stagnated there, but at the same time, there's the resistance in terms of when China is offering the GIP financing sort of like option. That's just one example. The second point in terms of related to Professor Edward Tse mentioned about the multipolar order. I think this is related to what I think is been often conducted when we talk about US-China relations and also geopolitics in the region. Is about the disregard over the agency of regional actors, actual actors, And this is most prominent and also not very much touched upon when we talk about geopolitics in terms of the financial structure of the region. You hear de-dollarization. You hear the internationalization of the renminbi. As if like, the US is trying to dominate with the dollar, China is trying to occupy the dollar by taking RMB as the alternative currency, but they disregard the fact that ASEAN +3 framework, especially in the past 6 years, meetings between ASEAN +3 Minister of Finance ministers and also central bank governors has been proposing plans to reduce dollar dependency because of the uncertainty of the geopolitics at the moment, and also promoting the use of local currencies. Plural, local currencies, not just about promoting Chinese RMB, but the use of greater local currencies. You hear also the petrodollar. There's changing situation with the petrodollar that we don't know. But this is actually just one aspect of it in terms of how multipolar order is shifting on every level. And I hope that people would sort of like pay attention to the fact that there are agencies in the region, countries in the region have a role in it, not just because we're smaller than we just sort of like reacting to China or the US. We do have agency.
That is probably the most important point, and I'm glad that's what we're ending it on. And I want to thank each of our panelists. I want to thank our guests, and I also want to thank GIFT for the wonderful opportunity to have this discussion today. And so, Renee, I will hand it back to you to conclude our event.
Thank you, Eric, Amal, Christine, Edward, and Srikanth for such an insightful discussion on the impact of China's economic transformation from the point of view of its regional partners and stakeholders. From tariffs to overcapacity to supply chains and iPhones, these really highlight the nuanced intricacies of global and regional economic and geopolitical relationships. Before we conclude with Chandran's closing remarks, I'd like to remind everyone that this conference's recording will be shared on the event website, GIFT's LinkedIn account, and GIFT's YouTube page. We will be hosting our second virtual conference of the series on the 20th of September, so please watch this space. We're also pleased to share that GIFT issues a monthly newsletter that offers our latest insights, programs, events, and reports. We also have a second newsletter called Tomorrow Matters, which features curated articles from local writers in Asia on a range of topics such as local and regional politics, economics, history, and culture. You can subscribe to our free newsletters on our website via the links in the chat box below. Now, I'd like to invite Chandran to share his final thoughts and give his closing remarks. Chandran, I'll now pass the time to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee, and to the panel. Thank you so much, Eric, as well, for staying up at some ungodly hour in the US and doing this. But your enthusiasm is infectious, and we can see you are so committed to what this whole dialogue is about and needs to be. So in my closing remarks, I just thought I'd go back to the title of the overarching title of what we are doing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the High Commissioner's Office in Hong Kong. The World in 2050, the impact of China's next stage of development and influence. And I think from the two panels, we've seen that, and people who with great knowledge have said, whilst the focus of our discussions has been China, the world in 2050 is simply not just about China. The world in 2050 is a multipolar world in which all countries, or many countries, will have agencies, and we will have to find new pathways towards what we call development and influence. And I was very intrigued to hear in the first panel the discussion focused on the economics, but a huge amount of questions and suggestions on the Q&A function about, well, what about food and agriculture, and how do we look at prosperity and all of those things? And then in the second panel, to also see everyone else talk about how other countries view the world and its relationship to China, but it's not just about China. So I'll conclude by just saying that I hope, and particularly for the listeners, people who have tuned in, come in for, we will have a second one in September. We are determining what the title should be under the context of the overarching theme. But in terms of looking at China's economic prospects and its global impacts, a couple of things come out, which I hope everyone will agree, that we have entered what I call the post-Western world. The post-Western world is not an anti-Western world or a pro-China world, and China displacing every other economies. But we're entering a new era. I think Edward and other people and all of the people in the second panel talked about how all these different countries are going to need to react differently. On the first panel, I thought the unanswered question, really, that everyone said is probably the most complex and most difficult, was the question about, do the economic sort of principles that we adhere to, the old one, the neoliberal narrative, can they survive and can we continue to abide by them to navigate a complex 21st century in which there are resource constraints, there's climate change as an existential threat, created not by forces that are mystical, but actually through our economic activities. So that's something that we are all going to have to confront. And I saw many comments by people saying, why are we not talking about this? And particularly in relation to China, where there's been a lot of discussion in China in recent years, and particularly led by the president himself, about building an eco-civilization. I think this will be also part of a major transformation. What economics do we follow to essentially create the eco-civilization? So that, I think, is also part of the transformation in China, but transformation that the world will have to embark on. What's the new world economic order going to look like? That too will translate, therefore, into who controls what resources and things like that. And finally, I would like to say that, as we heard, we'll need multilateral cooperation. And that's what I hope, institutes like us will continue to commit to. And so I want to say to everyone who's attended, if you have ideas about what these discussions should be, please let us know. If you would like to conduct one of these, please write to us. We've had a couple of inquiries about, is GIFT going to do another one? What we'd like to do, but we need support, and we like to be seen as an impartial mediator, bringing different parties together to discuss things without ideological biases, but to open these things up. So finally, can I say that I'd like to thank the High Commissioner's Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Hong Kong, from Government of China, for helping us do this and taking the initiative to foster this, allowing us the independence to bring together all the speakers and allowing the discussion to be unfiltered and open. And this is what I hope we will do much more. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and hope you'll all join us in the next one. And the challenge on our part would be to convene a forum in about 2 months' time or 3 months' time, which takes some of the discussions that we couldn't explore fully and enable a search for solutions and inquiry and debate, bringing different opinions together to foster, most importantly, international collaboration, dialogue, and in a world that is at the moment pained by war, to bring about peace, a peaceful rise, peaceful collaboration, and debate without conflict. Thank you so much for your support, and I look forward to seeing you all and many more. By the way, I've just been told by some of my colleagues that on some of the streaming platforms, we've had over 1,000 people dial in. So, and on other platforms, we've had many more. We haven't got full access, but the recording of this will be shared with everybody on our website. Tune in, share with friends, and spread the peace, as they say. Thank you very much.